All right. Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday, and welcome to today's nonprofit navigation session on delivering dignity. I'm Julie Klima, and I'm the managing director here at the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership at UMKC. Midwest Center catalyzes nonprofit and community organization success through education, engagement, research, and service. Today's nonprofit navigation session is part of a semi-regular series of educational programs that we do to allow the community to share ideas, tools, and conversations that nonprofits need to be successful. Before we get to today's topic, I have a couple of announcements. The salary and benefits survey is open. Please make sure that your organization responds so that we can provide this critical benchmarking data to help shape fair and competitive compensation practices in our region. Also, I want you to mark your calendars for this year's Nonprofit Leadership Conference. That's coming up on Monday, November 25th. This year's theme is Leading with Resilience, and we're lining up an excellent slate of sessions. And this year, in response to feedback that we got from previous conferences, we're going to try something new and offer a facilitated networking lunch instead of another plenary speaker. So you won't want to miss that opportunity to learn and connect with other nonprofit leaders. And then finally, our next nonprofit navigation session is coming up on September 25th, and that's going to be about the Board Diversity Initiative and how nonprofit executives, community members, and people from diverse identities with valuable skills who may have experienced barriers to getting onto boards can get involved with board service. So feel free to join us. That will be another free session. So throughout today's conversation, feel free to use the chat to ask questions anytime. I will be here monitoring that and sharing them out with Dr. Kirsten. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kirsten Brown Pursley, who is the author of Delivering Dignity, a guide to cultivating cultural competence. She's also the founder and CEO of Pursley Advisors, a strategic advising firm that specializes in supporting organizational leaders through strategic project support, training, consulting, and coaching, all of which are deeply rooted in the power of cultural competence. Prior to founding Pursley Advisors, Dr. Kirsten served as the executive director of a nonprofit here in Kansas City, where she led the successful relaunch of the Kansas City market and led strategies and initiatives to increase cultural competency, diversity, and belonging in corporations and small to mid-sized businesses. She also earned a doctorate from KU, where she studied and researched effective leadership. So thank you, Dr. Kirsten, for joining us, and I'll let you take it over from here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julie. I'm so excited to be here this morning. I'm going to screen share so that we can dive into our talk today. So I'm super excited today to be talking about delivering dignity and sharing some of the key components from my book. And so I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction, a self-introduction. Julie did such a great job kind of laying the foundation, but a little bit about me outside of my career. I'm a wife, I'm a mom, and I'm a mentor. That's just so important to me. I was an educator in Kansas City for several years. And so many of my students who were really young when I first met them, my former students, I should say, I'm still very much involved in their life and count myself as one of their mentors. And so that's just a huge part of what I love to do outside of work. And like was mentioned, I was an educator in the urban core for Kansas City for over a decade, a nonprofit leader, and now serve as a strategic advisor. And throughout my journey, my career, both throughout all the different stages, and as well as in my research and throughout my life, really started to understand this idea of dignity, which is the quality or state of being worthy, honored, or esteemed. And I thought about this quite a bit because oftentimes people talk about dignity and talk about how we need to treat others with dignity. But I did often notice a gap between the understanding of dignity and really being intentional about delivering dignity, especially for leaders to take that on and to really ensure that that is a centerpiece for that led them in the way that they served and led their teams. And so one of the biggest pieces of research that I did during my doctoral studies and then in a lot of my postdoctoral studies was understanding what do leaders do differently when they're able to have really committed teams where there is a strong commitment to the team really being champions of the mission and vision of the organization, and really feeling like they were a part of something bigger than themselves, where they would go really to the ends of the earth to in service of the organization's goals. And really what I found is that it's leaders who deliver dignity. They are the ones who are able to cultivate these types of teams. And they ensure that everyone is deeply understood and affirmed. And in doing that, they ensure that the expertise of those on their team and the perspective that everyone brings to the table is fully leveraged, which allows for radical results to be driven and to be realized within the organization. And so, as I continue to dig more into what it meant to deliver dignity and to make all of what I just said a reality, it's leaders who take this on as a responsibility, as a personal mandate to deliver dignity to all who work within their organization. And it's with that type of clarity that they have that they're able to really drive this culture forward. But then as I dug more into this, I've certainly realized that there were things that really made it difficult for leaders to deliver dignity and to do so effectively. And one of those things that were really, really critical in terms of having an adverse impact on the culture centered on dignity that leaders were trying to develop were these things called dignity breaches. And so I'm going to go through a couple of crucible moments, which is something that I talk through a lot in my book, to really set the stage and provide an illustration of what dignity breaches look like. So, in these crucible moments, these are situations that I experience in my own life in which my dignity was breached in some way. And the thing about a dignity breach, sometimes they are intentionally done, but more often than not, especially in the context of leadership, these dignity breaches occur unintentionally. And oftentimes we don't even know that we're perpetuating them. And so I'm going to give a couple of examples of dignity breaches in my life as I frame them through these crucible moments. And one is going to be one that was intentionally done. And this is actually like a childhood memory. So it does have really some strong implications for kind of our current reality as leaders. But the second thing that I want to point out is another crucible moment that was not, in which I experienced a dignity breach, in which there was a situation where it was unintentional. However, the harm was still there. And so, with a really model vulnerability in sharing these stories. And so, the first crucible moment that I can think of that, by the way, really, really shaped my life, as these crucible moments should, was when I was getting ready to start my first year of kindergarten. And this is one of my earliest memories. And I remember my parents had decided that I was going to be going to a school that was predominantly white. And I was really not used to being in a setting quite like the one I was entering into. And so, in a way to kind of prepare me for that reality, my parents had me watch a PBS documentary with them one evening before school started about the Jim Crow South. And I just remember feeling so incredibly like this sense of like despair and watching these images of seeing, the buildings being burned down and the Ku Klux Klan coming and attacking families, and all of these real images from our nation's history really stuck with me. And my great grandma was staying with us at the time and watching this documentary with us, and was providing her personal anecdotes and perspective, having lived through much of what was explained in that video. And that further really allowed me to understand that the weight and the reality of what I was watching. And I remember feeling quite scared that night, trying to sleep, just replaying those images and recalling that my parents did a really good job of having me unpack what I saw and engaging me in a conversation upon viewing the documentary, where they kind of explained that, what I was viewing that was rooted in hate and racism and things that I was trying to understand as a 5-year-old. And they wanted me to understand that what I was viewing still existed in my present context, and that I may experience some like an evolution of that may look different, but at the root of it was hatred and racism. And so I took that with me and went to my first day of kindergarten. And I will never forget it. I was sitting next to a young girl in my class, and our desks were touching, and we had an eraser that was kind of placed between our two desks. And she went to grab the eraser at the same time I did, and our hands met. And I just remember her face just had the most disgusted look on it as she touched my hand and began to vigorously wipe her hand on her shirt as if to wipe, what I perceived as like, oh, maybe the germs or something about me that she now has because she touched me. She's trying to get off of herself. And so just feeling just the sense of, why is she having such a strong reaction? What is it about me where, you know, I'm untouchable, like something's wrong with me, is how I internalize that moment. And so I then remember, there being limited opportunities for students to engage at the beginning of the class day. But then we had recess where we were able to more authentically engage with one another. And I remember at that point, none of the students would play with me at recess. And I remember going up to different groups of students, again, contextualizing. I was in a predominantly white school, and really not like me in my class. And I would go to different groups of students and ask to play, and they would say no over and over again. And I retreated to the kind of perimeter of the recess area where kids were playing outside. And I wanted to cry. I desperately wanted a sense of belonging. I didn't understand why I was not experiencing the sense of inclusion that everyone else was able to have as I watched them engage and have this time together. And as I saw these images of kids having a great time and wishing that I too could participate, I saw a first grader come up to me, and I had a sense of relief, like, oh my goodness, another kid has empathy, like they want to engage me and playing. I'm not going to be alone anymore. And this boy came up to me and said, "What are you looking at, blackface?" I was like, oh my gosh, I thought that I was going to have a transformative moment where I would at least have one friend and someone to engage with and have that sense of belonging. And it was the opposite of that. And it in my 5-year-old brain, that's where like the kind of the dam broke and the tears flowed on the recess blacktop where we've had it kind of like this asphalt blacktop where the kids played. And it just really cemented in my mind this idea of what my parents were trying to prepare me for. And because they had kind of prepared me for what might be my reality, I had the language to say, oh, I remember learning about this from what my parents told me. This is likely racism, my 5-year-old mind trying to make sense of what happened. And this is probably why I've been feeling like this throughout that whole day. And so that just was such a crucible moment for me because as I became a leader in my life, first a leader of my students as a teacher, and all the various leadership positions I held, I come back to that moment and use it as an empathy driver for my leadership. And that empathy driver really helps me better center on dignity because I remember how I felt when I didn't belong and when I was made to feel small by the words that people used. And of course, like I mentioned previously, this is a very clear example of a dignity breach that was intentional. These students, um, even though likely taught how to behave in such a way and these problematic mindsets, their actions were intentional, and it was like my dignity was actively being breached. And so what I invite you all to do as you reflect on your own crucible moments, consider how you can continue to think about those moments that have shaped you, that have built your empathy when you've experienced a dignity breach. Because going back to those moments and reflecting on those moments are really critical when you're working to center on dignity. Because it almost serves as this subconscious barrier to make sure that you are not perpetuating some of these dignity breaches, which often in leadership happen unintentionally. You just have a greater sensitivity and a stronger lens of knowing when that is taking place. And so that's something that I just really encourage leaders to do is to reflect on your crucible moments, record them, write them down somewhere, and every so often remind yourself of that. so that you are continuing to have that sense of empathy needed to drive your work forward. The second crucible moment that I'll share, and both of the ones I'm going to be sharing today are from childhood, but they just have really strong parallels to the work that we do as leaders in a modern context. And I remember I went to a predominantly white suburban high school in the Kansas City metro in the suburbs. And I was in a regular English class my freshman year. And one of my best friends at the time, we both cheered, were on the cheer squad together. And we were both in this English class and took the work so seriously. We loved learning. And I was always an avid reader and writer. And, at the time, at the end of the school year is when students had an opportunity to be recommended for the course that they would take the next school year. And so at my school, what happened was that teachers would physically write, the class they recommended you for, and they would sign off on it. And so I remember my friend, who was a white girl we were really close. We were best friends. She was able to go and talk to the teacher and got recommended for the advanced class our sophomore year in English. And I was so excited for her. And I was excited because we had the same grade. We were both equally as invested in the class. We participated. We were involved in the school. Just so many parallel points where I thought it was a given that when my name would be called, I too would be recommended for this advanced course of study. My name was then called. I went up to my teacher and she put me in the regular English course. I was not placed in the advanced class as I had anticipated being placed based on the context I provided previously. And I just remember feeling so confused, just thinking, what is it about me where I wasn't able to be placed in this course? We have the same grade. We're both equally as participatory in class. I was trying to make sense of it. And then I remembered that I could advocate for myself. And so later in the class period, I went up to the teacher and said, hey, could I see that my friend was placed in the English class that's more advanced for next year. We have the same grade. Could I also be placed in this course? And I remember my teacher had this look of shock on her face, like, oh, she was so surprised. She was like, you want to be in the advanced class? I'm like, yeah, I do want to be in this class. And she goes, okay, no problem. And she signed off, and that was great. But that moment was really, really critical for my life because I later went on to be an English teacher and teach many students how to read and to write effectively. And I became an author of a book, and I really think back to that moment. What would have been the impact if I did not have exposure to the opportunity to actually be in an advanced class because I had a friend who was in that class? If I didn't realize I could advocate for myself and knew how to do that effectively. And I think about how that could have impacted the trajectory of my life and the way in which I was able to impact others through having a more rigorous course of study, that it was clearly what I needed to excel, not only academically, but also in other points of my career later on. And so that really stuck with me because that helps, again, going back to this point of empathy, that helps me make sure that I am not limiting my perception of what others are capable of doing because of biases. And so that's something that is a sensitivity that I have as a leader that really, really helps me make sure that I am really trying to dispel biases and actively understand biases that I have and take them away as much as possible so that I am not perpetuating the same dignity breach that I experienced when I was in high school. This is also important because I always try to look for opportunities where folks can be developed. So I have a real clear sense. Are they really ready for the next level or to level up? Or do I have biases that are actually holding them back? And if I do some deep reflection and maybe they're not ready yet, how am I preparing them and supporting them to get to the next level? And that is what a dignity-centered leader does. They think about how they can support and not ways that are framed in kind of a deficit perspective when they think about those that they lead. Another point that's really, really critical for crucible moments, especially in a team context, if you're working with other leaders, it is so incredibly important, and I highly encourage this, that you all are sharing your crucible moments. This is really important. Not only are you able to deeply reflect and share out and speak power to the truth of your experiences, but it's important because you get to hear the perspective and these crucible moments that other people have had. And that's important because the more crucible moments you hear of others, the more times in which you hear about the ways in which folks have experienced dignity breaches, that allows you to then take their experiences and add as a part of your lens so that you have a deeper sensitivity and greater empathy for experiences in which dignity was breached that may not reflect your own personal experiences. You see, what I shared with you are deeply true to me and my life's experiences as a Black woman, as a woman who often was in spaces where I was one of the only or one of the few who look like me. But many of you may have crucible moments where there are other markers that other identity points or other ways in which dignity was breached that may be very different from my own. However, they're still so important. And the more we can share and be vulnerable about these crucible moments, and then extrapolating the impact those moments have had on us and the lens through which we view the world and our leadership, the more we're able to kind of have a strong kind of uh, a bag, so to speak, of different experiences we can pull from that just allow us to be way more empathetic leaders that then drives greater dignity when we're serving those in leadership. And so it's through this that I really want to zoom in on this dignity framework that I've created. And this came through years of research of really understanding what is dignity, how does that connect to effective leadership and high performing teams. And so, as you'll see, dignity really pours out from the center to every aspect related to different points that dignity centered leaders must attend to in order to truly deliver dignity. What you'll see next to dignity is relationships. That is truly at the core of how one delivers dignity. Because what I've come to realize in my research and through deep experiences is that what dignity is not one size fits all. The way I'm dignified may be different than how someone else is dignified. And as a leader, we only get to understand and know that if we understand and know the people we serve and the people we lead. And we can only do that if we build true, authentic relationships where trust is built and understanding is there so we can truly understand how they want to be dignified. And so you often, and I talk about this in my book a lot, you often hear about the golden rule, treat people the way you want to be treated. But what I'm really advocating for in the context of dignity-centered leadership is the platinum rule. You want to treat others the way they want to be treated. You only know how they want to be treated is if you know them. You only get to know them through authentic relationships. And so some of the elements that make this up include diversity. You have to understand that no one person or group is monolithic, and there's different points of intersectionality that make up people. So, for example, at face value, less people, leaders who aren't centered on dignity may say, oh, you're a Black woman, therefore you must X, Y, and Z. But they don't understand that there are many facets to me. Yes, certainly I'm a Black woman, but I'm also a Christian. I'm also a mother. I'm also a Midwesterner. There's all these different elements that make up the intersections that make up me as a person. And when folks fail to understand diversity and the different points of diversity that people bring to the table, they open themselves up to perpetuating dignity breaches because they see people as monolithic and they then in turn have these big generalizations that they place on folks, and they fail to see the individual humanity that we all bring to the table, which can definitely be damaging in terms of one's quest to deliver dignity. Another key component to this is empathy. And so we talk quite a bit about empathy when we discuss the crucible moment exercise. But I think it's so important that leaders are leading with empathy and they're really thinking through how they're supporting those they serve, how they're understanding the lived experiences of those they serve, and how they're also sharing about their lived experiences. And so, what I often encourage leaders to do is not only have those leader to leader points where you're sharing crucible moments, but also when you're with the folks that you're leading, you're sharing your crucible moments and allowing them the opportunity, rather inviting them to share their crucible moments as well. You're going to have a lot of empathy built for them because you're going to better understand who they are, what they've been through, and what frames their lens of life. And they'll have the same for you. And so, a great empathy driver and a way to build those strong, dignity rooted relationships on your team is to engage in these exercises like Crucible Moments, where folks can get vulnerable. And you, as the leader, you lead and model that and make it safe and really show people who you are and what drives you towards empathy. And you can also frame this as being really frank with folks like, hey, I really want to center on dignity as a leader. In doing that, I know empathy is really important. And so, one way I can do that is moving down to my next bubble right underneath empathy is to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is really important because it builds trust. And so, if you are engaging in crucible moment conversations with those you lead, you're going to have to be vulnerable and let them know that it's okay to be vulnerable. That's when you have trust, which really strengthen relationships, which then allow you to have a situation where you're delivering on dignity. Leaders have to model this and show that it's okay. And they do it in a way where they always extrapolate how the reflection from the vulnerability ties to the work. And so in the crucible moment, I try in that segment, I try to model that. I modeled vulnerability, and then I really tied that to leadership and what we're driving towards. And so the more you can drive it towards like how it connects to your mission or your goals, that's really critical for teams. And so, yes, there's always a time and place just to be vulnerable, like for the sake of vulnerability. Like, hey, I'll give an example. My grandmother died a few weeks ago, and I'm feeling really, really sad about that. And so, I told my team I may not be showing up as my best self for the next couple of weeks. That's really important vulnerability to give context for what I'm going through in life and let people know like I'm human and I have life things that happen and it impacts me in the way that I show up. But also, it's important to have vulnerable moments where you're clearly tying that to the goal that you and your team have, or a goal that you have as a leader, such as my goal to deliver dignity. The next bubble that we have is belonging. And this is really important because if folks are coming showing up to a place where they're not having a sense of belonging, I mean, there's so many research points about how that does not actually allow them to be their best selves. And so you want people to come feeling like they are a part of something bigger than themselves. When they feel like you are a leader who cultivates this organization or even a division within an organization where they are able to be who they are, they're then able to bring their perspective, they're able to challenge different actions or decisions in a way that, allows the organization to think differently about the current mode of operation. They're able to provide innovative ideas that maybe haven't been thought of before. Belonging is one of the critical pieces that happen when you have vulnerability and empathy and a diverse team. When you're really cultivating a sense of belonging, you're really able to bring forth diverse thought, perspective, and also innovation. But in order to cultivate all of this, you have to have essential cultural competence. And so, going back to that diversity bubble, if you're not understanding one's specific culture that they're bringing to the table and the different points of intersection that make up who they are as a whole person, you're what I often see in my work around this is that folks will say things that may come across as racist or offensive or any other type of thing that could be a breach based often on slight actions or words And this is actually where you see a lot of microaggressions happen from a lack of cultural competence. And often when I come in to support with environments where that has just been kind of the status quo, where it's microaggressive and folks really don't have that cultural competence and they're saying and doing things that are just really off-putting, they lack cultural competence. And so that's a huge piece that really needs to be recognized in one's quest to deliver dignity. And finally, the last bubble that's at the top next to diversity is equity. And equity is really important in order to deliver dignity. And what I often see with equity is that folks are always, having these like blanket, one size fits all policies and procedures in place in an organization. And that actually doesn't allow for equity to take hold. What that more aligns with is equality, which is doing the same for everyone. What really is more dignity centered is equity. It's giving everyone what they need to be successful. And so I often have leaders say, well, I don't want to lower the bar. And it's like, it's not about lowering the bar. The bar never changes. However, the level of support you give people to meet the bar may change and it may look different. And so that's really how you support folks to allow them to become their best. And when folks are supported and an individualized approach to become their best, that's when they're able to thrive. And that's where you really start reaping the benefits of dignity-centered leadership. And so all of these components that we just discussed within the framework are so, so critical for dignity-centered leadership. And one thing I encourage you all to do as leaders is to take inventory and even creating internal surveys or different ways to really get a clear sense of the way in which you are delivering on these key components that are critical for the delivering of dignity. So having some internal or even external audits on the extent that folks feel like they can be vulnerable and that they witness vulnerability from their leaders, and the extent to which people feel a sense of belonging, and also elicit feedback. If there is something where folks are saying, oh my gosh, there's a low amount of cultural competence in our organization, inviting folks to the table to get their perspective on how that can be fostered is really, really critical. So I'm going to pass through these because we've talked through all of these components. And I want to center on this. This is a picture of my daughter, Penny. She'll be 3 years old next month. And that's me and my husband in the back. And this picture is really important because when I think about inclusion and belonging, I think about Penny. And she's so good at modeling this for others. And I talk about the story a lot in my book because there was this instance in which my parents were in town and they were visiting. And Penny was running back and forth on our first floor and just having so much fun by herself, just running back and forth. And my husband and I were talking to my parents in the living room, and Penny stopped and she took each of us by the hand and took us to what she deemed to be the starting mark of where we were running. And Penny said, we're all going to run back and forth. We indulged her and we start running back and forth with Penny. And it really became included in the game that she had started for herself. And it actually became a lot of fun. But then later I noticed as we went back and forth several times, my dad got a little winded and he stopped. And Penny noticed that. And she went over to him and asked, are you okay? And he kind of explained, I'm a little tired, Penny. I think I need to take a break. And she said, okay, and let him take a break. But then every time she passed by, she would check in on him, make sure he was okay. And when he was finally okay, she took him by the hand and had him rejoin. And then we all went back and forth on this journey together. And so in that moment, I really thought about that and about how children often teach us some of the most powerful and profound leadership lessons. And, it was really simple and playing a game, but it was deeper than that. She really knew everyone who was, let's say, on her team within the family. She knew when something was off and she knew to take their hand and bring them along and to continue to give them the support that they needed to be okay. And so with my dad, she knew that she needed to provide a differentiated amount of support in order for him to continue the race. And that's what we all should do as dignity-centered leaders. We have to know our people. We have to know when something's off, check in on them because we have that authentic relationship. We're able to identify, oh my gosh, something isn't as it should be. I know how to check in with them, and I know how to support them so that they can continue running the race. We don't just let them flounder, but we provide a specific approach for how we know they are. And so part of this idea of cultivating cultural competence, it doesn't just happen by osmosis. It does need to be quite intentional. And one can engage in a socio-cultural competence review. And this is discussed quite a bit in my book. It is a research-based protocol, which allows one to really understand the biases and points of discrimination they may have that may be impeding their ability to deliver dignity. And so we all have biases. I've often heard it kind of likened to smog. You know, it's everywhere. There's pollutants everywhere, and we're like breathing it in all the time. And we just have to be aware of that. And so, in order to, once we have that awareness, we have to continuously check, like, what biases do I have? How are they evolving? Because the biases I may have today may be different 6 months from now, just based on life experiences and points of exposure. And so, I really recommend that at least quarterly leaders are sitting down and they're having this internal dialogue and really reflecting on, at this point in time, what biases do I have? Why do I have these biases? Did I have an experience? Did I read something? Did I see something on the news? Like, what is causing it? And it's like, when engaging in this, to really be like a judgment free for yourself, when you allow yourself not to judge yourself and just to be authentic, well, like, let's be real, what are these biases? You're able to actually get to the heart of what's going on. What I often see when I'm working with folks and coaching around these socio-cultural competence reviews, when they're really self-defensive, like, oh my gosh, I don't have biases or I'm working on them, and they're like always kind of defending it, they're actually not leaning into the process, and they're actually not recognizing the biases that exist. So just allow yourself, like, be like, no judgment. Everyone has biases that come up in some way, shape, or form. It's normal. But what's not okay is just to sit in it and not to recognize it and not to actively work to dismantle those biases. So, what biases do I have? Why do I have it? And then what points of discrimination do I have? And then what's the impact? Either the actual impact where you're like actually working and saying and doing things that are rooted in your biases, or potential impacts. Like, I don't think I've done anything yet, but I could see how down the road this could turn into me doing or saying X, Y, or Z. And what are those impacts of your biases and points of discrimination? That's really important to go through so that you can understand how to stop it and be more aware of it, which allows you to be less likely to perpetuate it. And then, quarterly, you'll go back and you may notice new things that have emerged that you need to contend with. So the next piece around this that we're going to dig into and zoom into, rather, is vulnerability and empathy, which we've already laid the groundwork for. And this is so important because it allows for honest two-way feedback. And so this is something that is often overlooked within the quest to deliver dignity. When folks are in a situation where they're noticing that they're leading someone who just isn't meeting the mark, they're doing something that just isn't okay, and they need to have that conversation and give feedback. A lot of folks don't want to have that conversation. They're uncomfortable. They can be awkward at times. But this is actually one of the most dignifying things you can do, is to give honest feedback, but also be receptive, truly receptive to honest feedback, and to create an environment and a culture where folks that you lead feel comfortable coming to you and being vulnerable, because they know you're going to be empathetic to hearing about what they have to say and really taking it to heart. That is when we see organizations really start to thrive, is when people can live with that level and operate with that level of vulnerability. It's funny, I'm currently in Kentucky. I'm speaking in about 2 hours at a summit with internet leaders from all over the world. And this is one of the things that they most requested topics is honest two-way feedback. A lot of people in myriad of contexts and a different, no matter what cultural lens they come from, this is something that's highly requested, because it really can be hard to do, especially if you're a leader who's trying to center on dignity. And so before you can really effectively go into those feedback conversations, it's so important to know yourself And I say this for a couple of reasons. If you're receiving feedback and you know yourself, you know that your natural tendency is to get defensive and to like defend the feedback and, start to, um, you know, not really take what is being given to you to heart, and it shows up to your team. They're not going to be likely to give you feedback, and you're going to really erode that trust and that vulnerability that allows for dignity centered cultures to take hold. And so, if you know that's your propensity, from the onset, you really need to make sure that you're working to being more open and even role playing how you're going to respond when you receive feedback, so that if that's not your natural inclination, you have that muscle memory built up in the role play where you're able to go to your key points so that you really show that you are receptive. And then if you know that you're someone who hears feedback, but you kind of like, okay, whatever, I'm not going to listen to it, you need to address that, and you need to think through how you can actually evaluate how you can take that feedback to heart and actually implement it. So often when I do organizational reviews, one of the biggest pieces of feedback I get from teams is that they give feedback, but they feel like it goes on deaf, it's like heard on deaf ears. And that's really something we want to make sure that we're addressing. We want to make sure that we're really understanding who we are giving feedback to, and that we are really making sure that we are being intentional about absorbing it and showing our team like we actually do hear you. Even if you don't adopt what the feedback says, you should still take your team on a journey of why you came to that decision and how you listened and grappled and made sense and meaning of the feedback that they gave you. A huge part of knowing yourself is to know how you're going to respond to giving feedback and also receiving feedback. So the giving feedback, if you know you're a bit awkward and it's a bit clunky when you have more difficult conversations, script it out. Make sure that you've thought about how you're going to tailor the feedback towards that individual, and not just some canned template of feedback, but you really use that person, knowing them, having built that relationship at the center of how you go about delivering that feedback. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we move from the conceptual to the actionable in what we've been discussing today. And so, things I would love for folks to either drop in the chat, or I encourage you to come off mute to start thinking through is, how can you authentically engage and share time with individuals who have different points of cultural identity from your own? That's really, really important, because what we often see is in the context of cultural competence, especially, and certainly vulnerability, empathy, all these pieces are so interconnected. When folks are in a silo of people who are like them, they really live in an echo chamber, and they're actually not able to have kind of this nuanced perspective that allows them to really engage with others who are different from themselves. And we know that diversity is such an incredible marker for organizational success, that if you are living in an echo chamber, you're outside of like different spaces of life, if the majority of where you spend your time, a lot of people look like you, they think like you, I really encourage you to authentically engage with folks who are different, and not like, hey, it's like a checkbox. Yeah, I have diverse friends now, or whatever, or just thing where you're like, it's coming across inauthentically. It really should be, you should be moved to do this if you really want to get to know someone and want to engage with them, because of who they are, not because you're trying to do something for yourself in terms of becoming more cultural competent. So I want to like have that caveat put in. Secondly, really think about the stories you need to begin to tell yourself to counter the bias-based stories you've adopted. So if you say, oh, I believe X about these types of people or this group or whatever it may be, however these biases and these stories show up in your mind, you really need to kind of counter these stories with new stories. So really encourage you, whenever those biases show up, to remind yourself of the news stories that actually are counter to what's rooted in the stories that are rooted in biases or discriminate points of discrimination. And finally, think about how you're going to hold yourself accountable for your biased thoughts and actions. So this is important. So again, we all have biased thoughts and actions. It's not okay just to sit in it and say, yeah, this is just what I have. And it's not okay to acknowledge to have the belief that you don't have any biased thoughts or actions, because everyone does. And so what's really important is to have like an accountability partner or some way that you're going to hold yourself accountable when that happens so that it's not just you by yourself trying to figure it out, but you really have like a point of support to not only hold you accountable, where you can come to them with vulnerability and say, "Hey, I messed up. This is what I did today," or "I had this thought." Um, they can provide grace, but also some understanding of how you can move forward to make sure that you don't continue to perpetuate and sit in that. And so, my final call to action for this amazing group here today is to know that delivering dignity is a personal journey for each of us. And although it's personal and it is different for each of us, we all need to be personally accountable for our organization's culture and the impact of the culture we create or permit. And so no matter where you sit in leadership, if it is positional leadership or if it's situational leadership, or maybe you don't have a formal leadership position, but people see you as a leader, we all have an obligation to uphold a certain uh, culture within our space. And so the goal is should always be to make that a dignity centered culture. And if you're really intentional about creating a dignity centered culture, you'll be successful at it. But if you're permitting things that just are counter to that, if you're allowing dignity breaches to happen, you're not addressing it, you're just operating business as usual, you're actually going to erode any efforts you have at cultivating this type of dignity centered culture. So it's really, if you are hearing this, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to put a stake in the ground. We are going to be a dignity centered leadership. I'm going to lead with dignity centered leadership. You have to make sure that you are kind of the gatekeeper of what happens within the organization as it relates to it. So really the buck should stop with you in terms of building up systems and structures and culture points that kind of allow for this to flourish. And you're shutting down things that just really align more to the dignity breaches we discussed previously. So would love to open it up to some Q&A and any reflections we may have. And so, Julie, I'll kick back to you.
Thanks, Kirsten. And thank you just for sharing your insights and your vulnerability with all of us here today. I've gotten a couple of direct messages that I think people didn't want to put in the chat, which totally get. And one of them relates to where you just were, which is, the leader being the one who really sets the tone. But we have somebody that asked, what do you do when you as the leader are the one who is different and feels like you're having your dignity breached, like you don't feel safe or welcome to belong and be your best self in the organization?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so, when that happens, think through who are some of the champions within the organization who could help to create like maybe like a dignity counselor, some type of group to help change the tide, so to speak. It should never just be on the leader to figure it out and to do it, especially if they're feeling like these dignity issues are the ones that they're being perpetuated against them personally. Find core people within an organization who can help create a kind of a coalition of folks who are creating the change. So it's not on you. And you can also, one thing I highly encourage is just be vulnerable about, hey, the we're really working to center our culture on dignity for all people to feel the sense of belonging. I'm gonna invite you all to like be champions in this work. We're starting kind of a coalition of folks who are going to be a part of this committee to help bring this change forth, who would like to be a part of it, and see who signs up for it. And also, you may encourage some people who may be really good fits, but maybe don't see themselves as being a part of the committee. Have conversations with them one-on-one to see if they'd be interested and if you think that they're going to be really impactful in that type of a role. And also, as that work is being kicked off, having points of vulnerability where you're naming how you're feeling as a leader and why this is something that you see as a need, and encourage others who may be feeling the way you do to also raise their voice and be vulnerable and express why this is a need. That's how you're going to start to see the tide turn, because you have a clear why and point of rationale. That's not just you as a leader, but other people as well. And then there's a call to action to create change around it, which is also a really, really important step in order to reverse the course.
That's great. Thank you. And along those lines, I just got another one that's how would you address sharing dignity breaches or experiences with other leaders who I think it's that you are observing are causing those for other members of the team, where you're the third party kind of observing it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So within that, it goes back to that feedback. And so you I'm going to go back to that slide back here. Really, it's what you permit allows for the culture to take place. So even if there's not someone that you directly manage, but maybe they're kind of a parallel leader, you still have to address it, because it will bleed into what you're attempting to do as a leader. And so I would just go back to like having those authentic feedback conversations. And so I maybe like, hi, Julie, do you have a second for some, like, I'm gonna role play. Is that okay,
Uh-huh.
Julie? Gotta go together. Okay.
Absolutely.
Hey, Julie, do you have a second for some feedback?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Hey, I just wanted to say, you're my girl. I always appreciated your leadership. You're just such a straight shooter and just so frank with the way that you lead. And I think that's so important, because you're just such a transparent leader. But one thing I did want to name is that I didn't notice that when you were talking to Sydney yesterday, you start to raise your voice at her. And I don't know if it was intentional or not, but I just think that the impact of that is that, because I felt like my kind of bristled, like, oh my goodness, I feel a little fearful of Julie in this moment, and I know her and she's my friend, but I couldn't imagine how that may have made Cindy felt. And I told you about that book I'm reading, Delivering Dignity, and how it's really important for us as leaders to cultivate this culture rooted in dignity, and just how that just not only makes people feel really great and like they belong, and they deeper care for the work that we're doing, but it also helps us really maximize their impact. um, I wanted to bring that to your attention because I know you, and I don't know if you realize how that came across, and I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that with me, and I want to think about it. And I want to I want to take some time to process. I don't want to gut reaction in the moment. But I would love to reconnect with you, and I'll follow up with you on this. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Julie. I'd love
Yeah.
that. Maybe we can
Yeah.
connect Friday around noon. Would that be okay for you?
Sounds fantastic.
Great, Julie. I look forward to talking to you then.
Yes. Yes.
So, scene.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
wanted to just kind of model like how that one way you could address it. The thing I want to like really punctuate here is that you have to address it. You can't know about something that's happening that's counter to the culture that the organization needs to have, and just because silence is permitting it.
Yeah. We had another question that was I guess two more questions. One is, let's pivot just a little bit. We're talking to nonprofits that are delivering services, to vulnerable populations. How do you see this, applying for them in their direct service work?
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is like, um, it's a nonprofit that's supporting vulnerable populations, and how does this framework really help those you're serving versus not necessarily the team, but those that you're serving? Is that correct, Julie?
Correct. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So we did a lot of work on this, and really the same principles apply. It's really how do you kind of distill these key points on delivering dignity, like these type of like dignity centered leadership points to your team, so that they see their themselves as the leaders of the culture they're trying to create for those they serve. And so the principles still remain. You just want to kind of flip it so that the team sees it as like um, it is their responsibility to deliver dignity for those they're serving.
That's great. Shifting to the thought on, identifying biases from, one of the things that you recommended in the sociocultural competency review. Do you have any frameworks or resources that you use, to help people identify their biases?
Yeah, definitely. So, my book talks about this quite a bit. And, I think going through that cultural competence review is going to be really, really important to do quarterly, to just kind of think through um, where might these biases exist. And so, what some people do is they try to rush through it and say, okay, I'm going to take 5 minutes and think through it and be done. I would highly recommend giving yourself the space and time to think deeply. And if you have a trusted person or group that you can engage in a dialogue around it, where you're actually going through the review together, sometimes verbalizing it allows you to kind of brainstorm on a deeper level and really start to think more deeply about the biases that may be shaking shape. And, another thing I want to say is proactively be kind of maybe even have a journal or someplace where you keep this information so that if you're watching the news or something and you're like, validate it, like, oh my gosh, I just had a crazy thought that was like deeply rooted in biases. Maybe jot that down so you remember it. So when you go to your sociocultural review, if it's like, maybe like, oh, I have that review of my team or my trusted group next week, you may want to write it down so you don't forget. Because we're not always thinking about our biases every moment of every day. And so if you have a thought around it, record it so you can go back to it when you're ready to really take that time to be deeply engaged in identifying those points of biases and how you're going to address them.
That's great. Thank you. Um, Somebody in the chat said, even in the same culture, people are different. So they appreciated you validating that there's no monolithic response. One more question came in. What opportunities do you provide to work with leadership teams and or staff around the concept of delivering dignity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll put my information here. We really do a lot of trainings for organizations around this. So the question around if we're trying to deliver dignity to those we serve, yes, we have a training for that. We have a training for that's leader specific, and then we have a training that's for like everyone in the organization, because really it's on everyone. Like, it starts with leaders, but everyone really has a role to play in delivering dignity for the organization. We also do offer coaching, so around like, oh my gosh, I'm struggling to identify biases, or just allow myself the permission to like realize that I have those biases. Anything kind of related to this, how to get the organization kind of on track to make sure that this is delivering dignity is like a full-fledged initiative we support with. And so really through coaching, our trainings, and then I also do talks like I'm doing today, where, just kind of giving an overview of the work and the need for it and the impact of implementing these types of practices.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, and I know you mentioned you're speaking again later today, so thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for sharing your insights, your candor, your vulnerability with us today. Thank you all for joining us, and for the leadership roles that you all hold in our community and the work that you do to just make our community more equitable and inclusive. I really appreciate you all taking the time today. I did put a couple of links in the chat for you, a link to Kirsten's website, as well as a link to the salary and benefits survey. And as always, you can find out more about our upcoming programs on our website at mcnl.org. Thank you again to everybody for joining us. And Dr. Kirsten, enjoy your speech today, and safe travels back to Kansas City.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.